great having you
Well,
here.
thank you. Thanks.
Yeah.
Um, that was very generous, and now all I can do is disappoint. Um, I'm not going to deliver a paper because I've been doing that all week, and I find it boring after a while. I thought though I would just talk about the book and sort of ease myself into something closer to a written statement at the end. I hope you can hear me. I have a bit of a sore throat, and it's been with me for a few weeks. So if anyone has any trouble hearing me, just fling something at me, and I'll try to raise the volume. This is not really a book of theology, though. I should point that out. It's because a book of theology would have to be a confessional statement in some sense, and this isn't. It's a very general book about metaphysics, and is not even confined to Christian tradition. I used to be a student of East Asian and Asian and East Asian religions as well, and languages, and it draws on Vedanta and Bhakti, on Muslim thought, as well as Jewish and Christian thought, even Sikh texts to some degree. The putative issue, though, what brought the book into existence, aside from an editor suggesting it to me, which is how most of my books get written, I have to confess, is that we've observed now for over a decade these current popular debates on, is this God fellow real or not, and not usually debates prosecuted with a great degree of either philosophical or rhetorical sophistication. It seems fairly obvious, or to me, that the picture of God presumed quite often by all parties in the debate is strangely unrelated to the statements classically made about God by every theistic tradition, to an almost surreal degree. We really are very much the heirs of the 17th century, not only of the deist picture of God, but of the whole vision of reality that attends that picture of God, the mechanistic understanding of nature. A picture of nature from which formal and final causes have more or less been evacuated. Nature understood as material forces exchanging energy without purpose but with effect, right? Christians, no less than non-Christians, were willing to embrace this picture of things. In the deist tradition, we still have a mechanical cosmos. There simply happens to be a God there, a technician, a demiurge, call him what you will, who explains its functioning, its order, its existence in some sense. But even then, existence in what sense is hard to say, because ontological questions tend to disappear in the 17th century to be replaced by questions of causal order. And what does this mean? It means that we've inhabited a picture of reality in which, when we look at nature, we're not looking at nature as theophany. We're not seeing it as something that participates in and therefore reveals to some limited degree the nature and presence of God. We're looking at it as an artifact which reveals perhaps the power of God, but not the nature of God, not the being of God, not the face of God. And so the default position for all parties, whether they know it or not, is already what's come to be thought of as naturalism, I suppose is the most popular term. Physicalism, mechanistic materialism, but naturalism, the notion that nature is a self-sufficient, self-explanatory reality that persists and operates in a mechanical manner, to which you may or may not add this additional entity, Mr. God, who explains some of the clever and more difficult aspects of that order. I'm not a great fan of the intelligent design movement, not because it's not possible to raise legitimate philosophical, legitimate scientific questions about the adequacy of a particular kind of neo-Darwinian synthesis. That's fine. I mean, even Stephen Jay Gould did that, and he was not a raving fundamentalist. But the picture of God, which always crops up in intelligent design texts, is a demiurge. It's a deist God. He's not the God of classical theism. Now, the title I gave this book, I never get my own titles. I just don't, except once, and then I decided I didn't like it. And even when I do get my own title, like The Doors of the Sea, inevitably someone sticks on a subtitle like Where Was God in the Tsunami, which sounds more like a Newsweek article title. But the original title I had, the subtitle now, was never going to fly anyway, Being, Consciousness, Bliss. But what that is some of you may know this, is a good Sanskrit or Hindi or even Pali phrase, Sat Chit Ananda. Have you heard this before? Satchidananda is sometimes as a single substantive. This is a very venerable Hindu, but not only Hindu, definition of the divine nature. You find it even in early Upanishadic texts, but it's common to all of Vedanta. It's very much at the heart of Bhaktic devotion. It's used also in Sikhism, and it is, very. How do we understand the divine nature and its fullness? We understand God as being, infinite consciousness, but also infinite bliss, infinite rejoicing. This same tercet appears in Sufi literature, Wujud, Wijdan, Wajd. Exactly the same, being, consciousness, bliss. There are passages in Augustine and in Gregory of Nyssa which say precisely the same thing about the Trinity. There's a wonderful passage in Gregory's De Anima et Resurrectione, which, if you were to step outside of the Trinitarian context, if you didn't know that he was a Christian, you could easily assume that it's an exercise in Vedantic metaphysics. And on and on. So you find it in Sikhism, of course, and elsewhere, and similar, and in William Law, curiously enough. I just discovered that recently. Anyway, why did I choose these? Well, for one thing, when I think about these terms, I think actually there's a profound insight here that any understanding of God as the absolute, who is also the God, the self-revealing God of creation and revelation, has to think of God in this way. I don't have several hours to say why, but I think this is right. But what's more interesting to me is it's not just a religious or a metaphysical description of the source of being that is also the personal God. It's a metaphysical description that rises inexorably from the most fundamental structures of our common experience of reality. Because it is a puzzle why someone like Ibn Arabi and someone like Shankara, who have no contact, and then you find that something similar in Augustine, are saying this about God. Basically these three metaphysical moments, using different language, but basically the same picture of what it is we affirm about God when we say He is God, is that there's something in our most primordial apprehension of what is, our encounter with everything, that, followed to its end, leads to these affirmations about God by in a quite continuous, logical way. It also, though, and this is sort of the secret project of the book, turns out that when you follow these basic structures of experience towards the end to which they seem to point, you discover that nowhere along that path is there a place for a true metaphysical naturalism to set up shop as a coherent logical position. By the end, if you think about the way our experience of reality is structured and the consequences towards which this points, it becomes almost incredible to try to make a naturalist case. Now, I would say this. Naturalism, let me first talk about these three moments, being, consciousness, and bliss. Naturalism would be a logically coherent, at least a logically plausible comportment towards reality if the universe didn't exist. Uh, Unfortunately, it seems to be doing exactly that, existing, that is. And that means, despite what Lawrence Krauss or Victor Sting or others who cannot get in their mind the distinction between the ontological question about the contingency of the universe and the cosmological question of how the current physical reality of the universe arises from a different state within a continuous physical system, despite those people, I'm sure there's an end to the sentence, but unfortunately, I've lost the syntactical thread there. Despite them, any proper contemplation simply on the wonder of being or the mystery of being apprises us that there is one fact that exceeds physical explanation. There's one fact about the universe that is not reducible to a natural fact, which is that the universe exists. Now, that this universe exists may be a physical, may have a physical explanation, this universe as opposed to one of a completely different kind. But existence as such is to put it very simply, nature is by definition that which exists. Therefore, no natural explanation of existence is sufficient. That being so, in our every encounter with the universe, this may sound very simple-minded, but we're confronted by a fact that is not natural, and hence naturalism as a whole is false. Because the basic premise of naturalism, as enunciated again and again, is that there are no facts that do not fit within the seamless narrative of nature. But I'll just say that I go through, without being nearly as exhaustive as I would need to be if I were actually trying to offer proofs of anything, but I go through the classical arguments for the reality of God, of not a necessary being, but of necessary being, from the contingency of the world. And I tend to think that in form and substance, those arguments are actually correct. That Peter van Inwagen and others who try to, the principle of sufficient reason is false and so on. I find most of those arguments wonderfully sophistical, but at the end of the day, not convincing. But that's not what I need to talk about today. Just take it as given that I'm a credulous traditionalist here. I think people like Aquinas were basically right, that there's that contingency requires the unconditional. But that's not, if there's any originality to my argument there, it's that I try to start from the original experience, our original experience of the strangeness, the fortuity, the oddity of being. We've all had this experience, of course, I hope. Anyone who hasn't needs to get out more. When you find yourself suddenly drawn to a pause, not by any object, you find yourself perplexed, not by any particular thing, but by thingness as such, by the very beingness of the world. You find yourself all at once reflecting, how strange, how odd, how implausible that anything at all is. And it's that moment of existential surprise, that moment of wonder at the mystery of being, which maybe when we're children, very small children, is a kind of habitual state of mind, but obviously not one that makes it easy to drive. So we have to get past it. In that experience of the fortuity of being, we are genuinely apprised of something about ontological contingency, about the ontological indigence of things, the world about us, the fact of existence. And from that moment of wonder, that awakening that is the awakening to all philosophy for Plato and for Aristotle, I try to move towards the affirmations of classical theism, which again I'm not going to try to describe here, but I will say this, that here first, in this moment, this experience, this encounter with being, and the metaphysical end, the religious end, the spiritual end towards which it, to my mind, almost ineluctably points, we find that already nature comes to us, we encounter nature always already under the form of that which is supernaturum, that which is hyperphysical, that which is supernatural. We approach nature only across the interval of the supernatural. That becomes a running and perhaps tediously repeated refrain in the book. Actually, I think I say it 3 times only, but I might be deluding myself. I might say it on every other page. But we approach nature across the interval of the supernatural. Now, when I talk about consciousness, and any of you have done basic philosophy of religion. Well, no, not philosophy of religion. Those classes tend to be taught by people who don't actually understand the classical arguments. Just as a rule, they tend to be taught by people who basically are thinking of a 17th century God that they then sort of force into 13th or 5th century arguments, and that doesn't make sense, you know. The God of Descartes doesn't fit, say, the 5 ways of Thomas Aquinas. It's simply... When talking about consciousness, I'm actually in a strange position of being, I discovered while writing this book, in more or less the philosophical mainstream, because in philosophy of mind, all the cutting-edge work has more or less moved away from strict materialism. And this is because the materialist picture of consciousness is largely incoherent. I mean, there's just no way of resolving the problems that consistently raise themselves. I mean, and I'm not talking about theistic philosophers. I mean people like David Chalmers, who's very eccentric, but not, or Thomas Nagel, or even John Searle, who wouldn't want to admit that he's not a materialist, but isn't really. In some cases, this is just a matter of all the classical problems of consciousness that have never been dealt with in a way that could hold together. Just things like qualia, that is a qualitative dimension of our experience of the world, just your subjective experience of colors and flavors and sounds, or abstraction, or how the mind forms abstractions, or the syntax and semantics of reason, trying to map that onto what are supposedly the purely mechanical material transactions that occur within the neurons of your brain. There's a problem here. One should be causal and one should not, and yet it seems that we actually can reason ourselves to the end of say, a syllogism by ligations that are based on the semantic content, the logical content of what we're saying, not on the electrochemistry of the brain, and so on. And principle, for me, of course, it seems to me the greatest problem of all, intentionality, that is the directedness of the mind, its capacity to confer and infer meaning under aspects, under particular aspects. I go through all of that at some length in the book, and intentionality especially strikes me as a sort of insurmountable obstacle to a naive, mechanistic, physicalist picture of how thinking or how the mind works. And the solutions that were given over the past century and a half, such as emergentism, that consciousness is an emergent state from a basically physical basis whenever they're examined in depth. And again, I'm saying this is not a theological claim, and it's not a claim that even requires any particular religious faith. It's just the arguments simply tend to dissolve under their own incoherence. Supervenience, the notion that somehow consciousness is real but is supervenient upon a material substrate, such that any transitions that occur at the level of consciousness must be matched or paralleled by changes that occur entirely according to the rules of the conservation of energy at the level of material events. That's incoherent, obviously, because then what you're really talking about will turn out to be, and this is another school of thought, epiphenomenalism, which is that consciousness has no causal power whatsoever. It's only an illusion that it does, and so on and so forth. The most logically consistent position, it's the one that you find in Daniel Dennett under a different name, or the one that you find explicitly in Paul and Patricia Churchland's work or in Alex Rosenberg's work, is eliminativism, which simply says there's no such thing as consciousness. That's an illusion. There's no such thing as intrinsic intentionality. Therefore, I'm not using meaningful words and you're not understanding them. That too is an illusion. Of course, you might argue that an illusion would seem to be an intentional structure, but that's an illusion. We have to eliminate that. That's all folk psychology. At the end of the day, there are physical realities. There are molecules, and those molecules arise from a more basic level that physics can describe. So basically, it's physics, chemistry, biology, mind in a continuum. Below the level of physics, we're getting down to quantum superpositions. That becomes frightening. But that's the continuum. Anything that any time that we talk in terms of purposes, will, idea, conception, desire, that's folk psychology and it's nonsense. But the eliminativist position is, as I say, the most consistent because it really is the only one that preserves a genuine materialist metaphysics intact. That it is complete nonsense is not the issue. Because, and if you want evidence that we are dealing here with a clash of fundamentalisms quite often in the public sphere, understand that the eliminativist position, that Alex Rosenberg and others, Daniel Dennett, has become the default position for everyone. If every other attempt to make sense of consciousness in terms of physical events should prove to be a problem, basically everyone is leaving the eliminativist position open, that you have no consciousness. Given that, I probably don't have to go on any further. I can just cash my check because we can't really be having this conversation. The other, do I have a check though? That's what I do. The computational model of mind has become very popular, and Daniel Dennett's not really, how can I put this, smart. I'm trying to be nice about this, but he writes very long books, but they don't seem to have any actual arguments in them. They just have statements. Some of the statements are very clever, but he does have this tendency to think that if he says it 3 times, it's an established fact. And one of the computational model of mind, the problem is, I won't go to, but of course it is very attractive to think of consciousness in terms of computation because we have computers now. We see what powerful devices they are. And it looks to us like a computer is doing something like thinking. Now, it may not be aware as yet, but with sufficient complexity, perhaps awareness. People in the strong artificial intelligence community believe this, that consciousness is simply a matter of cumulative complexity. The problem is, and this is an argument that was made powerfully by John Searle, not, again, an atheist, and Daniel Dennett, whenever he argues with Searle, attacks an old argument of Searle's called the Chinese room argument. Any of you have heard of this? Right. It doesn't matter because his more interesting argument was made later, which is basically that, of course, as physical events, there's no such thing as computation in a computer. The computer, there are no physical objects, but there are also no physical events, which are computation. The computation is purely an intentional structure that is provided by our consciousness using that the way we'd use a typewriter or an abacus or anything else. And he argues this compellingly enough. Anyway, I'm taking too long on consciousness because I've gotten more and more interested in the topic. But here, too, we encounter an irreducibility to physical explanation. Here, too, we encounter something, and I know I'm using supernatural in an ambiguous and defective sense, perhaps, but we encounter that which is supernaturum, that which stands outside the naturalist narrative. Once again, if nature is to be understood as a self-sufficient continuum in the experience of consciousness, already the world is given to us under a supernatural form. We approach nature across the interval of the supernatural. And I think that, and I spend a lot of time trying to dematerialize consciousness, even though, because again, trying to start from basic experiences of reality and move towards classical metaphysical predicates, it makes sense to say that if we do away with the notion of the materialist basis of consciousness, it becomes the Platonists, the Vedantists, the Christians, and all those other eccentrics may have been onto something when they started from the opposite direction and assumed that the ground of all of reality is consciousness, maybe divine mind, something beyond comprehension, but that it does not follow from anything we know scientifically, and certainly not from any coherent account we can give of something called nature, that we should assume the opposite. And then we're confronted with the reality of the fittedness of mind and world to one another, of the coherence that seems to obtain between them, assuming that the eliminativists are wrong and we really do have experiences and ideas and we have experiences of truths and we can enunciate them and talk to one another and buy coffee for one another and that sort of thing. And in the book I will argue, that makes perfect sense then in the classical tradition to see the ultimate coincidence of being and mind as being God himself. And for that reason, the rational structure of reality and the aptitudes of mind are transparent to one another. Again, a long argument. I even express a great sympathy for Bernard Lonergan's argument. Did anyone ever read Insight? Well, yeah, you have to. But I mean, yeah, a big book. Lonergan, Canadian Christian philosopher, brilliant man. But in that book, he made the argument that ultimately to see to believe that reality consists in or reality is limitlessly intelligible inevitably must lead to the conclusion that all of reality is an unrestricted act of understanding at its ground, that it is the mind of God. Now again, I ask you to forgive me, and notice again that so far that I've made no theological claims, and again, I want to emphasize this is not a theological book. This is purely a metaphysical. But nonetheless, it's a metaphysical conclusion that is the common property of all the great theistic traditions. And even not technically theistic traditions, I think it fits well into Chittamatra forms of Buddhism. Some, that is Yogacara, if you have ever studied this, and other schools of thought, but that's a different matter. Now, when I talk about bliss, there I spend most of the time just talking about the transcendentals, the criterial transcendentals, the true, the good, the beautiful. My principal concern in talking about those is to point out again that when we talk about transcendental values, transcendental ends, we're not talking about something that can be reduced to private moods. We are actually talking about the most fundamental structure of consciousness. The way we encounter the world is always within the embrace of an ecstatic structure of consciousness. At the very ground of all experience, there is already this necessary intentional orientation to a transcendental horizon. I'm actually going to read a few words from the book because I'm wearing down here, and I'm fine. But it's also a great way of killing time. But it's just that I found it's easier than trying to summarize the point I'm trying to make about the transcendentals. And consciousness does not merely passively reflect the reality of the world. I don't know because I'm working from my manuscript. I'm going to read along to see if I get it right. So, see if I pronounce everything correctly. It's necessarily a dynamic movement of reason and will towards reality. We could never know the world from a purely receptive position. To know anything, the mind must be actively disposed towards what lies outside itself. The world is intelligible to us because we reach out towards it or beyond it, coming to know the endless diversity of particular things within the embrace of a more general and abstract yearning for the knowledge of truth. In every moment of awareness, the mind at once receives and composes the world, discerning meaning in the objects of experience precisely and conferring meaning upon them. Thus, consciousness lies open to and enters into intimate communion with the forms of things. Every venture of reason towards an end, and I do want to stress that every venture of reason is prompted by a desire of the mind, a rational appetite for and aboriginal inclination towards the ideal comprehensibility of things as a whole. That infinite horizon of intelligibility that is being itself. The mind does not take in sensory data like wax receiving the impression of a signet, but is constantly at work organizing what it receives from the senses into form and meaning, and this because it has a natural compulsion to do so, an interestedness that exceeds all individual objects. We can view the great majority of particular, by the way, this is a long passage, so you can settle in. We can view the great majority of particular things we come across in a disinterested way and even in a wholly uninterested way, and yet still experience them as objects of recognition and reflection only because we are driven by a prior and consuming interest in reality as such. I should point out here, actually, I have great, some of you, if you're in philosophical theology, might do work in transcendental Thomism, you know, that tradition that stretches really from Brentano through Rahner and others. There's quite a lot there worth thinking about. There simply is no such thing as knowledge entirely devoid of desire. You could not make cognitive sense of a glass of water or a tree on a hill apart from the action of your mind towards some end found either in that thing or beyond it. And so all knowledge involves an adventure of the mind beyond itself. Desire, moreover, is never purely spontaneous. It is of its nature teleological, and every rational act is intrinsically purposive, prompted by some final cause. One cannot so much as freely stir a finger without the lure of some aim, proximate or remote, great or small, constant or evanescent. And necessarily whatever it is that compels thought onward, whatever that horizon of limitless directedness of consciousness that allows the mind to define the limits of the world it knows, it is an end that lies always further beyond the near at hand. Why, again, is this important? Because in the basic structure of consciousness, again, it's not simply that the being of the world presents us with a fact that is supernaturum, or that consciousness places us at a vantage outside of nature in a sense, not outside in an ultimate ontological sense, but one that we find ourselves approaching it from a vantage which is also outside the naturalist narrative. It's also the case that the end of consciousness is already determined, is already shaped by, is already structured by that which is beyond the natural. Another passage, more or less from there on. An essential mystery then lies at the very heart of rational life. In all experience there's a movement of the self beyond the self, an ecstasy of the mind towards an end that resides nowhere within physical nature as a closed system of causes and effects. All rational experience, all knowledge is a kind of rapture prompted by a longing that cannot be exhausted by a finite object. For no finite thing is desirable simply in itself. That's not to say it's not desirable in itself. If only in the trivial sense that whatever we find desirable about that thing corresponds to some prior or more general disposition of the appetites and will. I might, for example, conceive a longing for a beautiful object out of the purest aesthetic motives, and this still means that I cannot regard the object as its own index of meaning. I'm moved by a more constant and general desire for beauty as such, as an absolute value of which I have some sort of intentional grasp, and in light of which I'm able to judge the object before me as either beautiful or not. It pleases me because the appetite it appeases, without wholly satisfying, is a more original and expansive longing for the beautiful. And if not for that rather abstract and exalted orientation of the will, if I were entirely devoid of aesthetic longings of any kind, refined or coarse, passionate or tepid, I would not desire it at all. There's always a kind of deferral of finite desire towards ultimate ends, and there's always a greater and a more remote purpose for the sake of which one wants whatever one wants. All concretely limited aspirations of the will are sustained within formerly limitless aspirations of the will towards those ultimate values that alone are desirable entirely in and of themselves, which we call the transcendentals. Now, I use, again, this is just the structure of the argument. What interests me here is simply that the whole experience of reality we share has this transcendental structure. Our minds and wills are in an absolutely necessary way related to being and everything that exists and to existence itself, always under the forms provided by certain absolute orientations of imagination, will, desire, and, for want of a better word, faith. It's that horizon towards which the mind is always turned and against which every finite object is set off in clear and distinct outlines in the middle distance of the phenomenal world. And this is not a mood or a private disposition only, of which one has to be continuously conscious, I should say. It's not the case that in every instant of experience one is immediately aware of seeking the true, the good, the beautiful. I'm not talking about a psychological truth. I'm talking about the structure of all experience. And again, whether one believes these are actual ontological constituents of reality or that they're only fortunate illusions that have in some unimaginably improbable way emerged from the hypertrophy of our animal brains, it is by their transcendence of all finite conditions that they give us a world. Now, that means that here too, we approach nature across the interval of the supernatural. It is given to us wholly in those terms. Again, I want to emphasize, remember, the point I'm trying to make in the book is how the definition of a God is arrived at, what it is, why it is, how it differs from this sort of late modern mechanistic model of nature, deistic model of God. If it seems that I'm going far afield, I'm not really, but you'll have to read the book to find out. And as I say, it's available here for the price of a mere $70. After I take my cut. $20, but $70 today. No, $20. Yeah, it's actually quite cheap. Yale is very good. They print things at an affordable price. I don't know what they're thinking. I mean, Oxford will sell you a book for $140, and yeah. So, let me see. I printed out, oh gosh, a whole lot apparently from the book. I didn't mean to do that. Let me just talk about naturalism then and end my remarks. It seems to me that really the most egregious of naturalism's deficiencies. I mean, there are all sorts of problems with the way, or physicalism if you prefer, whatever you like to call it, and those who care about these things make fine distinctions. I'm a physicalist but not a naturalist. I'm a naturalist but not a materialist. But when you chase the premises down, they all end up in the same place. I like the term naturalism because it's a big narrative. It's a big story. Whatever we mean by nature, we mean it's not supernatural. We mean it can account for itself fully, that it's causally closed. But what I found at the end of writing the book, it actually wasn't how I started out. What I decided was the most egregious of its deficiencies was the impossibility of isolating its supposed foundation, the strange abstraction, self-sufficient nature, as a genuinely independent reality of which we have some sort of cognizance, or in which we even have good cause to believe. I mean, we might be tempted to imagine that the purely materialist approach to reality is the soundest default position we have because supposedly it can be grounded in empirical experience. The material order, after all, we assume we have an immediate knowledge. While of any more transcendental reality, we can form only conjectures or fantasies, and what is nature except matter in motion, but this is wrong, both in fact and in principle. For one thing, we don't actually have an immediate knowledge of the material order in itself. I mean, we know that. We know only its phenomenal aspects by which our minds organize our sensory experiences. Even matter, when we use it in these contexts, and it still seems to be odd that 90 years after the first unpleasant experience with, say, the wave-particle duality, or just the problem of trying to figure out whether the wave function collapses or not as a result of observation, or whether it creates, therefore, a posterior history of a particle that prior to that was a superposition of states, and so on and so forth. 90 years after that, we really shouldn't be talking about matter this naively anyway. And yet you get physicists like Stinger and Krauss who know this, who are the most avid sort of Democritean sort of, matter is just this stuff that's there, and that's all it is, and it just bounces around, and even though their own That's the metaphysical context within which they speak, even though their own science militates against that sort of naive picture. But even matter is only a general concept that has to be imposed on the data of the senses for us to interpret them as experiences of any particular kind of reality, material rather than mental. And any logical connection we imagine exists between empirical experience of the material order and the ideology of scientific naturalism is entirely illusory. Between our sensory impressions and the abstract concept of some causally closed autonomous order called nature, there's simply no correlation. It's a concept that can determine how we think about our sensory impressions, but those impressions can't in turn provide any evidence in favor of the concept. Neither can anything else. We have no immediate experience of nature in this sense at all. As this perfectly closed self-explanatory reality. We don't even have a coherent notion of what such a thing might be. The object has never appeared. No such phenomenon has ever been observed or experienced or cogently described. We cannot encounter the world. I'm just summing up here. This is the structure of the middle of the book, at least. I won't talk about the end of the book except to say that it's all about prayer and about capitalism and how bad it is, because I've got really suspect politics, but that's not the issue, or maybe it is. I do think that I do think the new atheists are basically just the inevitable result of consumerism. I think when you look at how bad the books are, first that they're rather stupid books that sell at a kind of Walmart level of consciousness, but it's not that. It's and nothing against people who work at Walmart or anything. It's not that. That's not a cloud. I'm talking about bright, glittery plastic reality as opposed to organism and idea and things where and thought. And I'm obviously getting a bit tired here. We cannot encounter the world without encountering at the same time the being of the world, part one, which is a mystery that can never be dispelled by any physical explanation of reality, inasmuch as it's a mystery logically prior to and in excess of the physical order. We cannot encounter the world, furthermore, except in the luminous medium of intentional and unified consciousness, which defies every reduction to purely physiological causes, but which also corresponds to an essential intelligibility in being itself. We cannot encounter the world finally except through our conscious and intentional orientation towards the absolute, if you will, in pursuit of a final bliss that beckons to us from within those transcendental desires that constitute the very structure of rational thought and that open all of reality to us precisely by bearing us on towards ends that lie beyond the totality of physical things. The whole of nature, whatever it is, the whole of nature is something prepared for us, composed for us, given to us, delivered into our care by a supernatural dispensation. All this being so, plausibly one could say that God, the infinite wellspring of being, consciousness, and bliss that is the source, order, and end of all reality, is evident everywhere, inescapably present to us, while autonomous nature is something that has never, even for a moment, come into view. But maybe I'm wrong. I'm not. But the point is that starting from within the horizon of those three terms, being, consciousness, and bliss, I try to reconstruct a classical picture of God because, again, I thought it would be very nice to be able to start from the structure of experience and move towards the metaphysical conclusions. Because quite often I find that, and even among writers I much admire, the metaphysical arguments are made, but in something of a vacuum. That is, they're provided logical basis. I'm not denying that, but quite often no connection is made between the things that they want you to believe and the things you already know. But the book ends. I would point out, though, that the book ends saying, at the end, the recommendation I make is not a philosophical one. It really is about prayer. contemplative prayer. Because after all, there are people like Jerry Coyne. Right now, Jerry Coyne, if you know who he is doing a regular exegesis of my book on atheistweb.com or whatever I don't know what it's called. Jerry Coyne is a biologist at the University of Chicago who keeps jumping into these debates, even though I'm sure he's a gifted genetic biologist. I think he's done good work on fruit flies. And the fruit fly community has given him an award, I believe. But when it comes to just simple philosophical logic, I swear he could not reason his way all the way to the end of a syllogism without getting lost. It's just not. It's not something he does. But at the end, they do demand evidence, not just logical argument, because since they don't believe, it's Jerry Coyne, it's not going to follow a logical argument, so you can make a logical argument to him over 300 pages, and he's going to say, yeah, but why do you believe that? And, so you just have to give up. If they demand evidence, there are evidentiary methods out there that all the traditions recommend, paths of prayer, paths of devotion. If you want to know if the living God is the living God, look for him where he is said to be, but not elsewhere. Anyway, I'll stop there because I think I've kept us about 45 minutes. So, all right. Thanks. Thank you.
All of these will be on the website, are on our website, and the website is Project Unlive Theology, and it's a fabulous website. As you know, folks, those of you know who run websites, you need to kind of update it every 2 or 3 years. So we're currently making some changes and trying to get the speed improved, but nonetheless, it's going to be terrific and even better in a month or two. But this whole session will be on available. Yes, so let's get started with Q&A, and I do have instructions to hand you the microphone and have you ask your question or make a comment into the mic. So who would like to get started? Yes.
Okay. I'd actually just like to invite you to talk a little bit more. I was pretty fascinated that you equated consumerism and consumer society with Walmart level thinking. And I'm interested.
I equated Jerry Coyne's mind with Walmart level thinking.
And his thinking is the inevitable result of consumerism, right? And then you also put prayer in the same section, if I understand, as capitalism. You said you're talking about capitalism. I'm sort of wondering, I'd love to hear you talk more about your thoughts there. Why do they go together? Do you think capitalism is hostile to prayer, and is consumerism hostile to really well-reasoned thought?
Are you a member of the Rand Society or something? I just want to make sure. I want to know how hostile the audience can get here. I think that, seriously, I think that a late capitalist culture, any capitalist culture, but one that in Adorno's terms is truly consumerist, is a culture whose primary cultural task, the great adventure of the culture, is the fabrication of desires, and ever more desires for an ever greater diversity of things, desires for things that were not even desirable before they became necessities, and then to make room for other desires. Within that sort of order of social, cultural relations, in which acquisition and disposal becomes the primary business of life. I mean, look, we're surrounded by advertising all the time. We don't even think about it. It's a white noise, but that's what our culture does. It's teaching us to fabricate desires. There are problems for such a culture is inherently atheist. It has to be. That doesn't mean that that you can't live a perfectly decent life within building a small business or building a business and employing people. That's not what I mean. I'm talking about the consumerist culture. Is one in which prohibitions on desire progressively have to be erased, right? New desires have to be fabricated constantly for things that ultimate values that could possibly distract from or detract from or act as rivals to the momentary, the finite, desires by which the economy is sustained and the culture advances have to be abolished, and there is no value more problematic than God, because he might actually send you out into the desert rather than into the world of business. This isn't an opprobrium cast to people who make their lives making things and employing people. That's not. But you can do that without having embraced the culture and the inherent nihilism of consumerist capitalism. And so, yeah, no, I think there is a necessary. And what I see in the New Atheists is a kind of predictably vulgar expression of this need to do away with. There are a lot of things I see in the New Atheists. I also see contemptible Western supremacism. Sort of late modern notion that those who've not embraced the late modern Western mechanist vision of reality have cultures that are worthless. I mean, literally worthless. You get sort of the Quinean notion, or Ryleyan notion rather. The only light that comes from the east is the sun. Aboriginal culture in Australia with this very rich language, say, of the dreaming. That's meaningless because, of course, it's not mechanism. It's just folk mythology. It's not even folk psychology. So there's that. There are any number of things I see in the New Atheists. I just see it as a popular expression of this imperative of a capitalist culture to do away with this monstrous rival to the market, God. And prayer, I think, is an essentially subversive activity in a culture like that. Prayer is the one thing you should not be allowed to do in a truly good consumerist culture. It gets in the way of advertising. It gets in the way of your openness to advertising. You should be opening your pores and your mind and your soul to constant advertising. And prayer is something else that should be discouraged. So, yeah, I do see a link there. Anyway.
Yes, after you tweet, monstrous rival to the market, God.
Someday someone will explain to me what Twitter is.
What would you prefer instead? What other orders have been more oriented to the good? Is this order uniquely hostile to the good?
Oh, I think first of all, I mean, there's no ideal human condition in the fallen world. I can't point to any. I can point to certain things that other ages and other cultures got right that we get wrong, but that also in those cultures got a lot of things wrong, So you don't have to idealize anything, but you can say that the late modern West is post-Christian. I mean, it really is. It's not pre-Christian, it's not pagan, it's not imperfectly baptized the way Christendom was. It is post-Christian, and therefore it uniquely instantiates values that are the rejection of, the flight from, that are ontologically irreconcilable with those Christian commitments, because that is precisely the sort of the unique venture of late modernity. It is escaping. It's escaping from the prison of that faith, from that picture of reality, that pre-mechanistic, pre-capitalist, pre-nationalist, pre-individualist world of values. So I would say it's not as violently evil sometimes. Well, it is. I mean, how do we sustain our way of life? There's the massive economic injustice of the way in which we produce cheap goods and sell them, and it's also a way of life sustained by, a terrorist war conducted with predator drones. So it is as violent as any other human regime, but even when it's not violent, its chronic language, the whole logic of the culture, is one that's antithetical to a Christian vision of reality in ways that other cultures have not been. So I think it is something new, something especially problematic.
Yes, hi. Enjoyed your presentation. Quick question about, we're in Bonhoeffer House, and it's about Bonhoeffer and the Holocaust had a lot to do with this particular time frame. You're talking in terms of a theistic God. Can you put this, or your book and all of this, and you can comment on that. How would you address the nature of the Holocaust within the context of your book and your thoughts there?
Well, Well, no, it's just that you don't want to let anyone off the hook. So I don't want to address it in a way that leaves out of the story, say, centuries of sins of Christendom as well. But every cultural regime, every philosophy has its own sorts of evils. And in the 20th century, I think it's clear that all the greatest evils prosecuted on the scale of the state are intimately involved with the mechanical view of reality, with the mechanistic view of reality. That is, that humanity becomes a technology, life becomes a technology. Now, it could be a racial technology, as with the Nazis, that has to be reconstructed from the ground up. It can be an economic technology, a social technology, as with the great communist totalitarianisms. But it's not an accident that the kind of social morality that was being enunciated in the Weimar period and leading up to the Holocaust was grounded in this progressivist eugenics view of creating a better humanity, because humanity had been reduced to a kind of organic technology that could be corrected. As again, every age has its abuses. I mean, in the name of saving souls, Thomas Aquinas would make arguments for killing heretics. So it's not. No matter what system of values you're proclaiming, evil is something humans do. But it makes all the difference in the world on a fairly large scale when you're thinking about how should I correct these behaviors? How do you want to correct the moral condition of individuals, or how do we fix the technology of the human species, especially if there's no God that gives us this this ultimate index of what a human being is. What's the great imperative of the future? It's to create the perfectly engineered society, the perfectly engineered human animal. That leads to a special kind of horror of its own, and the Holocaust is in a large part an expression of that triumph of the mechanistic. What is the great charter of the mechanistic age? It's the Baconian notion. We're trying to gain power over nature. Knowledge is power. Knowledge is not the disinterested theoretical contemplation of truth in its showing of itself. Rather Heideggerian here, right? Power, knowledge is mastery, and with and he even gets Leibniz takes that language. And I'm not blaming Leibniz for this. He's summarized. It's Leibniz who talks about putting nature on the rack. That is the language of the time. This project of the mechanistic, inductive regime of science, on the one hand, is very liberating for understanding the discrete processes of the physical world. On the other hand, though, it's allied to a project of power, and that includes the rise of colonialism, the birth of the nation state in its full efflorescence, early kinds of capitalism, the rebirth of the chattel slave trade. All of that language has a strange, it's all echoing itself, and the mechanistic description of nature, the metaphysically mechanistic description of nature, is explicitly part of a project of power over nature. And so I don't think you can even begin to understand the Third Reich or the other great totalitarianisms of the 20th century except within that long history of reconceiving knowledge as domination, because we've been able to reconceive nature as technology.
Questions, comments?
I have nothing more to say.
Oh, sorry. I could help.
My name's Peter. So insofar as
this now.
Insofar as your book is in many ways trying to engage by clarifying the public debate over the existence of God, It seems, in my own experience and victimization of that debate, that there's been a prominent evangelical voice. And so people like William Lane Craig and Ravi Zacharias and John Lennox and Stuart McAllister. And so recognizing that your book isn't meant to be theological or even Christian theological, I guess as almost a political comment, what do you see as the place of the Bible within the unabashedly and exclusively Christian voice in the public debate of the existence of God? Namely because most evangelicals don't just kind of want to stand up and say, you know, the God of any sort exists, but a God that jives with Genesis and whose heart, quote unquote, is expressed eventually in some way in what we see in Revelations 21 and 22. And so going from your, I think, beautiful attempt to clarify the question of God as it's asked publicly to the theo-political concerns of the prominent evangelical voice in the debate.
Well, yes. The thing is, I'm not terrifically sophisticated in my knowledge of how those debates go on. I know with William Lane Craig, for instance, I have such profound disagreements with him on what he's talking about when he talks about God. He's what Brian Davies calls a theistic personalist. And this is true also, I mean, of Alvin Plantinga and Richard Swinburne. And I'm very much a believer that it's the classical theist picture of God that makes sense. I don't know what to make of this basically finite Zeus character that would emerge. Now that's not, I mean, I don't say it because of course he doesn't have the character of Zeus. He has the character of one who would die for those he loves. I'm not trying to mock William Lane Craig. I'm just saying that's the problem, is I can't really ally myself with it because I think Craig is if he ever had that debate with Dawkins that Dawkins won't have. And we know why Dawkins won't have it, because he's not a philosopher and he knows he would look bad, but he can come up with good excuses. But but if you had the debate, I would prefer the believer in, I suppose, well, I don't even know if that's true, to be honest, because when Dawkins refused to debate Craig, he pointed to an exegesis of William Lane Craig's of an Old Testament passage, with which I found myself agreeing with Dawkins entirely, that the crudity of the argument being made by William Lane Craig was morally really offensive. So I don't even know if I agree with that. So that's the essence of your question, the place of the Bible. How is the Bible read? Well, in the late modern period, we have the Bible being treated more or less as a kind of positivist text of on the order of a scientific manual. If I'm obliged to argue, with people who believe in the inerrancy of Scripture, by which they mean literalist interpretations that say that Noah's Ark is a real story about an historical event, then the game's already lost. I don't care who wins that debate because I'm not in any camp there. What was the literal reading of Scripture in the patristic and medieval periods? It meant reading ad literam. It meant taking the literal text and following its meaning through, but it wasn't literalist. It wasn't the presumption that everything described there actually happened. Thus, when Augustine writes De Genesi ad literam, when he the literal exegesis of Genesis, you read that, there's no fundamentalist who's going to think that that's a literal reading of Genesis, because he doesn't believe in the six-day creation account as a literal historical unfolding. So the place of Scripture in these debates is, if Scripture is read in the way, in this great tradition of exegesis, the patristic and the medieval traditions, which have varying degrees of people holding literal beliefs. I mean, Augustine believed the story of the Garden of Eden. No reason he shouldn't. I mean, they didn't have geology at the time. And so, Origen believed that was allegorical all the way through. Okay. But none of them was a literalist. None of them believed that the truth of the Bible had anything to do with whether it simply always was describing an historically objective event. That was not the problem. That was not the question. So whether the Holy Spirit could speak to not only in the inspired text, but to the inspired reader. Okay? So that's the place of the Bible. But if The Bible is going to be brought into ridicule by being held up as what it isn't, as a sort of historical record of how the story got going 6,000 years ago. I would rather that the apologists for that sort of reading lose the debate. Okay. So.
My name is Joe. So in the metaphysical picture that you're giving us, does the picture entail participation by ordered degrees, or is that a tradition-specific presentation of it?
Well, first of all, make the question clearer, because you're talking within a specific lingo.
I guess part of my question is whether it is possible to view nature as a whole as all participating as one in God. And therefore there may be being relations in there, but not relations of degree, some things participating more in the good than other things, or whether some things are more good than other things, and the standard by which those differences are measured is God, which is the measure or standard of all of it.
Right. So everyone's got that. Okay. Every tradition I know of thinks of participation in that sense. That is that they all acknowledge privations. Even Vedanta, Shankara is quite clear on this. That now those privations become Maya for Shankara, the degree to which Maya reigns. That is delusion, but delusion actually is a moral category for him as well as epistemic, and so I don't think it's tradition specific. I mean, it's very Neoplatonic, very Christian. It's you find it in Moses Maimonides though, and in Philo too, though he doesn't talk much about participation. He goes definitely in Ibn Sina, in Mulla Sadra, Ibn Rashid too, Ibn Arabi. So yeah, no, I don't think it's. I think that any story of any picture of participation is going to think in terms of the scale of. It's not just that you can be more good; you can have more being. Mm-hmm. That is that a hospice that's looking after the poor participates more in being than a death camp does. Because it's such a distortion of the goodness of being that the privation actually gives it. So being thought there is having its full plenitude in God, in whom the transcendentals are one, convertible with his essence. I would say I don't talk about it much in the book. I mean, I'd say that's pretty general across all these traditions. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your talk. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the relevance, if there is any, to the artistic sensibility of man, and whether or not that is a pursuit of the transcendental value, or do I just need to read The Beauty of the Infinite to find out?
You need to buy The Beauty of the Infinite. I wouldn't bother to read it, but buying it, I think, is crucial for your soul. Yeah, I mean, that's, of course, the problem is if you get on my pet topic, we could be here a really long time. Obviously, yeah, I believe it is crucial, and of all the transcendental aspirations of human nature, the ones that declare that we are oriented towards a supernatural end in our embrace of the natural, I mean that we embrace the natural. I have the greatest weakness for talking about that. I mean, that's what I'll go on about for a long time. Though it doesn't have to be, I mean, the sense of the beautiful, and I would say in modern aesthetics, beauty is often treated as something that's not to be talked about. Modern aesthetics tends to treat it as a nebulous concept, whereas rather than nebulous, the word that might work is transcendental. It's not reducible to a single finite set of characteristics, but gives an orientation and a value to those various defining orientations. That I think is absolutely crucial. But it doesn't have to be just the sort of exalted products of the aesthete and the artist. I mean, anybody who tends a garden or cooks a beautiful meal, or you know, it's something expresses itself at the humblest of levels too. So but obviously I like talking about Bach and Nabokov and so. But I really can't go on because I'll just keep going on. So.
Yeah, hey, I'm Chris. So
Hi, Chris.
Hey.
Haven't seen you for a long time.
Good to see you too. In response to Christina's question, you said you talked about prayer as an affront to market capitalism, and so therefore as a kind of practice that has at least economic, if not social and kind of political consequences to it. So I was wondering,
it's like the Desert Fathers had no iPads, and even if you put them, some of them would, but never mind. Just kidding.
Well, so I was wondering, do you mean that are you including corporate sort of church prayer and individual prayer in that, and do you see a difference between those practices? And then also, could you reflect on any other church practices that you think also may have certain kind of political consequences or implications to them in the same way as prayer?
Well, I would think all church practices should have political consequences to them, but I mean, it's certainly an economic expenditure is basically the first rule of Christianity. I mean, you give all you have to the poor and follow me, or Christ on the cross, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. I mean, there's no limit, and there's a hideous impracticality to the sort of things that Christianity demands of people. Caring for the poor, the destitute, those who probably never will. I mean, we know that there are certain people in society who not only do not make a contribution to the concrete wealth of the society as a whole, but never will. They're disabled, or their personal conditions simply make it impossible. They've just bad fortune to all of that. And I'm not saying modern. I mean, modern liberal democratic society goes some way towards looking after people in an admirable way. I mean, these ideas have remained with us. So I'm not saying that we're all it's all going to be the fountainhead hereafter. I just mean that nonetheless all of those should have political consequences and political meanings. Corporate and private prayer are part of a continuum, but obviously in different modalities, different registers. I don't think one can really. One by itself without the other is not going to this is not going to sustain itself in you. And corporate prayer as well as private prayer, yes, is a distraction from other kinds of desire. Is principally the kinds of desire that our culture is very interested in fabricating in us. I mean, we live in an economic culture that is sustained by the acquisition of the needless. And to a degree that would make the most, we can point to conspicuous examples of abuses and wealth. The Petit Trianon, Versailles, it's very vulgar, but in a more chronic and pervasive way now, we're all Marie Antoinette in that sense, and that we absolutely must have that crinoline. Because everyone else and our society is telling us this is a moral is a moral command. It's not just we want to be seen and we want to be out and about and we like nice things. It's good to like nice things. Nice things are nice, but it's a constant, a pervasive, a relentless demand that our desires be the desires for these things first, and I think that the life of prayer is the cultivation of a completely different order of desire towards God and the neighbor that is a rival to that fashioning of the soul, and should be, at least.
Questions, comments? Just out of curiosity, have you debated Dawkins and any of his comrades?
I was supposed to have a debate with Richard Hitchens this was something that was in a development stage. I think it was going to be at Columbia. I think they're trying to get George Stephanopoulos to be the moderator. I don't know how far the things went because that's when his camera started. And the pity of that is I actually would have enjoyed that. I mean, the pity of that is that he died, and that's the pity of it. I just mean that I actually had a great sympathy for Christopher Hitchens because of the New Atheists. He was the one that seemed, however chaotic his mind was, he had a moral hunger there, a moral sense that seemed more admirable than that of Richard Dawkins, the way Dawkins writes. So, but no. As I say, though, Jerry Coyne is posting weekly on this book. Apparently, he's gotten to page 35 and he understands it all the way. In fact, he wrote his first attack on it before he'd read it. So, I mean, that really, that is a very economical way to go about the thing. I mean, there. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Just on the note of the last series of questions, what would your view or take be on the seeming increase in secular interest in meditation practices under the rubric of mindfulness, for better or for worse? Do you see that as a possible corrective insofar as supposed scientific support or study of how this will make you healthier and calmer and all these, how do I say it right, commercially driven motivations, but if the practice actually brings somebody into silence and openness and turning off the electronics for however long, do you see that as a possible corrective, or is there a different danger in it?
I don't know, really. I think both. I mean, isn't it always the case that it's both and? I mean, I think that that it obviously is happening because there's a felt need. People are aware of this sort of pervasive pressure, anxiety. It's predictably because of the culture we live in. It's going to be expressed in two complementary ways. One, as a kind of mechanistic thing. Neuroscience has shown that if you do this, the following can result from it, and it's good for your health, which is makes you more productive. So you're going to get the commercial and the mechanistic expressions of it at the same time, since all things can be redeemed. It seems obvious. I mean, it seems that it also is an awareness, if at times untutored, of a real spiritual need, of a spiritual emptiness that requires attending to, and that could maybe be cultivated and turned into something more of a garden. So I mean, I wouldn't be dismissive or contemptuous of it. I don't. I think, but obviously, if it's expressed, say in these ways, there's something defective in the way it's being recommended to. Have a retreat at the Benedictine Abbey, and your sales will go up 7% in the next quarter. It's not quite the way you want to recommend it.
And on that note, do you have I mean, I'm sure you express it in the book, but reasons for hope or a suggestion?
No one's ever accused me of hope. I think we go through. I think that on the one hand, we really are at a post-Christian moment in the late modern West. I don't think there's going to be a return. I think there's a difference between, say, I years ago I remember a friend saying, well, Gaul was Christian and then it sort of lost the faith and then it was re-evangelized by Irish monks. But there you're talking about a wavering between Christianity and paganism. These are not contrary impulses. They're different aspects of the same impulse. In a post-Christian culture, you really do exist in a period. A state of disenchantment and rejection, and so expecting a great spiritual renewal of the culture would, I think, be worse. It wouldn't be hope. It would just be silly optimism. At the same time, I think it's a culture that's inherently contradictory. I think there's a violence to it and a sterility to it. That contradiction may just be that it withers away, and it's also not a very philoprogenitive culture. we have fewer babies, and so it may be that other populations that don't suffer from our mechanistic prejudices and bigotries and delusions will start changing the shape of the population. I don't know. But I do think that there are such inherent contradictions. I mean, look, when I was talking about the eliminativists, what's the lesson to be taken from that? You've got Alex Rosenberg at Duke. I guess it's your fault then, really. Alex Rosenberg. He writes a book on the Atheist Guide to Reality, and it is perfectly coherent, consistent. I mean, the arguments for naturalism are bad. No, they just are. They're not very good. He doesn't do a good job there, but I don't think those arguments can be made good anyway. But he's pitilessly consistent with himself. Yeah, there really is no such thing as consciousness. There is no such thing as intrinsic intentionality. There is no such thing as good and evil. There's, all the way down. All right, the same thing to do at the end of that is to say, that's absurd. That's a reductio ad absurdum. I know there's such a thing as consciousness, intentional consciousness, therefore my premises are wrong. No, he embraces it. This is the way. Those contradictions may be obvious in his case, less obvious in others, but there is such an inherent contradiction in this view of things, and in a materialist culture in which trying to sustain, most people want to be good people. They want to sustain the notion. But a culture that constantly militates against any coherent notion of the good as an ontological, definable end of desire. That I think that it's not a culture that can sustain itself. So I think on some distant horizon, spiritual longing will always reassert itself. And so.
Would the reason be if the nature of reality is being consciousness and bliss, would that itself be leading us toward that? And that anything that is so directly militating against that would self-destruct eventually.
That's what I believe, certainly. Yeah. No, I believe it's just that it was like was it Martin Luther King Jr. when it was one of these. I don't think I got the point. It was a Southern policeman who was threatening with something. He said, "You do realize that you're standing against the metaphysical structure of reality." I was just playing with him, but he was trying to make. But what he's saying is right. I mean, I believe that the real nature of what is cannot be. I mean, you can sustain a perverse and cruel indifference to it for a long time, but not indefinitely. So.
We have 5 or 6 more minutes, and I think Daniel had a question here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hart, for being here today. Thank you also for your critiques of Levinas, Deleuze, and The Beauty of the Infinite, and also know that book...
I've taken back a lot of the Levinas.
Oh, have you? Oh, well, I'm out of date. I'm terribly sorry, and I'll work on it. Reading, it takes time and effort, and TV is quite easy. But I wanted to ask if you thought that the loss of creativity in our creative, obsessed culture perhaps coincided with the idea of the loss of consciousness as desire of that beyond itself. And furthermore, with that, perhaps that leads into why we now think of creativity within the context of causality versus causality in the context of creativity.
The latter half of the question I can't answer because I'm not quite sure what you're asking, to be honest. But I think that just to put it in very simple terms, that if you're talking about creativity and the desire for that which lies beyond, cultural production does tend to follow spiritual aspiration. That is, a culture produces Chartres or the great Jain temples for India, or the Well-Tempered Clavier, even, which is not a specifically sacred work, right? A culture that in which that sort of I hate to use the term cultural production, but I've been reading a lot of Walter Benjamin lately. It has to do with the height of the spiritual aspiration that's recognized as the atmosphere in which desire takes place, shape. vaguely that sense. And the degree to which that is withdrawn, it's Nietzsche's sacred canopy being drawn back, the height of the aspiration, there will be a decline in creativity. I think, that's just obvious. People say, well, every age seems inferior in our minds to some earlier age. But at the level of artistic creation, ours is an impoverished epoch. It simply is. And why is that? In part has to do with just material realities, the nature of the economic and material reality of late industrial production. But it also has to do with this drawing in at the horizon of recognized objects of desire, recognized orientations of desire. That which is beyond becomes that which is near at hand. Art becomes self-expression rather than an attunement of the imagination and will to that which expresses what is infinitely more than the self. I think that's true. I probably, because I'm getting tired and wasn't listening, I didn't really get the second half of your question. I was listening. I wasn't listening intelligently.
Mr. Hart,
supremely intelligently. I wasn't listening carefully.
Well, I didn't say it carefully. I simply meant once one creates a cup, it's then sitting there, and an agent of causality can affect it. So once I create the cup, I then put it in a way into causality, rather than causality give rise to the cup, which is as a result of creativity. So there almost seems to be a kind of irony to consciousness, because once I use it to bring that which is beyond into being, it then becomes almost I'm then conscious of that which is not beyond consciousness. Just like once in capitalism, there almost seems to be a towardness in regard to consumerism, because once people create wealth, it then is oriented toward consuming that which was created, and ironically becomes, in a way, self-destructive, unless people can, in their own way, remember the necessity of creativity, since all the forces are going to make them toward consumerism.
That sort of forgetfulness is simply I'm afraid that's not just a cultural condition. That's just a condition that of everyone, really, is that's just one form of a sort of forgetfulness that is precisely what makes us forget being consciousness bliss, for instance. And part of that is simply the inevitability of making our way through a material world. But if you get to a culture, and again, this sounds very Heideggerian, but if you arrive at a point where you're at a cultural moment that is the residue of a long process in which we've been instructed to think of causality as efficient force, as of technology being the reigning paradigm of how we approach reality, for Heidegger, the enframing, all of nature reduced to the standing reserve, then you have a cultural situation in which that forgetfulness has become the reigning picture. And I think that's especially true in a late capitalist and in a culture, and in one that embraces kind of tacit mechanistic metaphysics, if we're talking about the same things.
Thank you. Can I just close with one question from your book?
I was going to say close with a prayer, but no, go.
Well, it could be. You have plenty of prayers in here. These little, what do you call these short narratives between chapters are just gorgeous. Meditations on the sleeper and the dreamer. But this is on page 84, and I was really intrigued by this passage. This is the conclusion of the Pictures of the World chapter. You write, however, I should also admit here, however, that I proceed in this way because as I have begun to grow somewhat older than I really want to be, I have also begun to vest less faith in certain forms of argument, or at least in their power to persuade the unwilling, and more in certain sorts of experience, certain ways of encountering reality, to phrase the matter with infuriating vagueness. I don't think that's vague at all. Bonhoeffer begins talking about Wirklichkeit als Christus, Christus als Wirklichkeit, and to use notions of ethical responsibility as sacraments, and to really affirm a kind of creational integrity that moved him farther away from Barth. But for those of us who came of age in one form or another, in the wake of the Barthian Revolution, and were habituated to be suspicious of experience in all its forms, I have never heard you speak directly on Barth's critique of the 19th century and the kind of triumph of experience as a kind of, the access into participation with God, experience as, ascetic or moral or materialistic in some form. And I am grateful for your rehabilitation of experience. And I'd just like to hear you say a bit more about how you stand in that conversation.
Well, every time I say something about Barth, a Barthian appears on my doorstep telling me, first of all, I've got it completely wrong, and even if I've got it right, I'm wrong anyway on moral grounds. So I don't know. I have real problems with Barth because I understand why he entered into the arguments he did. And as I get older, I find myself more sort of, well, I'm not ancient, but I'm, my batting average would be pretty bad today if I stood up to play. I have this deeper and deeper sympathy with Romanticism, in part because it is a rebellion against this sort of mechanistic reductionism. And Barth, even up till the end, even when you get to texts like The Humanity of God, which it has a lot of wonderful stuff in it, still this dialectical anxiety remains there. And since I don't think dialectically, I have a very hard time with it, that if you just so much as crack open the door to natural knowledge as a path towards the transcendent, then you must be, this in some way detracts from God's sovereign self-revelation in Christ. And I just don't have that anxiety. I mean, I think, all things, nature, culture, the personal experience, all of it tends towards the one from whom it comes. And I could never stand his remarks on religion, for instance, that religion is man's way of seeking to save himself, and because it just seemed to me, again, it's dialectically appealing. That is, it's stark and it's startling, and it's incredibly false, though. I mean, it's just, the religious experience of all peoples has always been this calling of the restless heart towards what's beyond. It's not simply, human beings trying to become their own, each one trying to become his own Prometheus. Again, I don't know how I stand in that conversation. I just know that the dialectical anxiety that's in Barth, I find, is totally absent from me. So.
And that is a wonderful way to finish this seminar. Thank you again
Thank you.
for extraordinary exchange. And thanks to all of you.